Here's an idea that sounds almost too good to be true. What if there was one single dashboard where you could see every consent you've ever given to every company and switch any of them on or off whenever you wanted? That's the vision behind consent managers, and it's one of the most distinctive features of India's DPDP framework. In this chapter, we're going to unpack what these consent managers actually are and why they matter. We'll start with the basic definition and then explore the role they play in the wider consent ecosystem, because they sit in a genuinely unique position between individuals and organizations. We'll look at how they register with the Data Protection Board, the obligations they carry toward data principles, and the technical and interoperability expectations they have to meet, which is where a lot of the real complexity lives. We'll cover their record keeping and audit duties, and we'll think carefully about when you, as an organization, actually need to involve a consent manager versus when you don't. Then we'll walk through a consent flow in action so you can see the whole thing move, and finish with a checklist. Consent managers are new, a little abstract at first, and easy to misunderstand. So let's slow down and make them concrete together. Let me start by clearing up what a consent manager actually is, because the name can be a bit misleading. A consent manager is not just a piece of software your company installs. It's a distinct, registered entity whose entire job is to act as a single point through which a data principal can give, manage, review, and withdraw their consent. So this is the official concept, but let me break it down in everyday terms. Imagine you have dozens of subscriptions, streaming, news, shopping, all charging your card. Now imagine a single app where you could see every one of them and cancel any with one tap. A consent manager aims to do that, but for your data permissions instead of your subscriptions. Here's the crucial part. The consent manager works for the individual, not for the companies collecting data. It's accountable to the data principal. That's a deliberate design choice because it puts a neutral intermediary between you and the organizations that want your data. Think of it like an escrow agent in a property deal, a trusted middle party that both sides rely on, but who serves the integrity of the process. So when you hear consent manager, don't picture a cookie banner. Picture a registered, accountable entity standing in the middle, helping ordinary people actually control where their data goes. Now that you know what a consent manager is, let's see where it sits in the bigger picture, because its position is what makes it powerful. Picture the consent ecosystem as a triangle. At one corner, you have the data principal, the individual. At another, the data fiduciary, the organization wanting to process data. And the consent manager sits in the middle, connecting them. Without a consent manager, every consent relationship is a separate, direct line between you and each company. You consent here, you consent there, and pretty soon you've lost track of who has what. It's chaos. The consent manager collapses all those scattered lines into one organized hub. Here's an analogy I like. Think of how a travel aggregator sits between you and dozens of airlines. Instead of visiting each airline's site separately, you go to one place that talks to all of them. The consent manager plays a similar connecting role, but for consent rather than flights. Why does this matter for the ecosystem as a whole? Because it shifts power back toward the individual. When consent is centralized and visible, people can actually exercise meaningful control. They can see the full picture and act on it. For organizations, it means consent becomes more standardized and auditable. So the consent manager isn't just a convenience, it's a structural rebalancing of who holds the reins. Because a consent manager holds such a sensitive, trusted position, not just anyone can set up shop as one. They have to register with the Data Protection Board, and this is where the rules get specific. Let me explain why registration matters before we get into the mechanics. Think about it. This is an entity that will sit at the center of countless people's data permissions. If it's careless, compromised, or dishonest, the damage spreads everywhere. So registration acts as a gatekeeper, a way of ensuring only credible, capable entities take on this role. The rules set out conditions a consent manager must satisfy to register, covering things like its financial soundness, its technical capability, and its independence. That independence point is important. A consent manager is generally expected to operate without conflicts that would compromise its loyalty to the data principle. Imagine if your supposedly neutral consent manager was secretly owned by an advertising giant that benefited from you sharing more data. You'd never fully trust it, would you? Registration conditions are designed to prevent exactly that kind of conflict. There are also obligations around maintaining a certain corporate standing and meeting standards the board prescribes. Here's the takeaway for you. If your organization is considering becoming a consent manager, understand that this is a regulated role with real entry requirements. And if you're relying on one, check that it's properly registered, because that registration is your assurance it's been vetted. Let's talk about who the consent manager actually answers to, because this is the heart of what makes the model work. The answer is clear and deliberate. The consent manager is accountable to the data principal, the individual above all. Why does this matter so much? Because in most data relationships, the power sits with the organization. The consent manager flips that. It's legally bound to act in the interest of the person whose consent it manages. Think of it like a financial advisor with a fiduciary duty. A good advisor is legally required to put your interests ahead of their own commissions. The consent manager carries a comparable duty of loyalty toward the data principle. So, what does that look like in practice? It means the consent manager must act on the individual's instructions, give them a clear way to review and withdraw consents, and avoid acting against their interests. Imagine you tell your consent manager, revoke my data sharing with that shopping app. It must carry that out faithfully and promptly, not drag its feet because the shopping app would prefer otherwise. Here's a rhetorical question worth sitting with. What good is a middleman who quietly sides with the other party? None at all. That's why the rules anchor the consent manager's accountability firmly to the individual. When you evaluate or design one of these, this loyalty is the test that matters most. Now let's get into the engine room, the technical side, because a consent manager only works if it can actually talk to everyone. And this is where interoperability becomes the make or break factor. Let me explain the challenge first. A consent manager is useless if it can only communicate with a handful of companies. To deliver on its promise, it needs to connect with many fiduciaries across many sectors, and they all need to speak a common language. Think about email for a second. The reason email works is that everyone agreed on common standards, so a message from one provider reaches any other. Without that agreement, email would be a mess of isolated islands. The consent manager faces the same problem. It needs standardized ways to record consent, transmit it, and signal withdrawal so that any participating fiduciary can understand and honor it. So the rules and the surrounding framework expect consent managers to be built on interoperable, standards-based technology. That means consistent data formats, secure interfaces, and the ability to exchange consent signals reliably. Here's why this matters for you. If you're a fiduciary planning to integrate with consent managers, you'll need systems that can receive and act on these standardized consent signals, not bespoke one-off connections. And if you're building a consent manager, interoperability isn't a nice feature to add later. It's the foundation. Without it, the whole single dashboard vision quietly falls apart. Let's talk about something that sounds dull but is genuinely critical: record keeping. Because here's the thing about consent. If you can't prove it, you might as well not have it. The consent manager carries a serious duty to maintain accurate records of the consents it handles. Why does this matter so much? Imagine a dispute. A data principal says, I never agreed to that. The company says, yes, you did. Who's right? Without solid records, it's just one word against another. The consent manager's records become the neutral, reliable source of truth that settles questions like this. Think of it like a bank statement. You trust your bank balance because every transaction is logged, time-stamped, and auditable. The consent manager's records play the same role for consent transactions: when consent was given, for what purpose, and when it was withdrawn. And those records aren't just for internal comfort, they support audits. A consent manager can be examined to confirm it's actually doing its job faithfully and securely. That audit readiness is part of what justifies the trust placed in it. Here's the practical lesson, and it extends beyond consent managers to your own organization. Treat record keeping not as bureaucratic overhead, but as your evidence locker. The day something goes wrong, those records are what protect you. A consent manager that keeps clean, auditable logs is one you can actually rely on. Here's a question I get a lot. Do I actually have to use a consent manager? And the honest answer is, it depends. So let's reason through it together. First, an important clarification. The consent manager framework gives data principals a channel to manage consent, but it doesn't mean every single interaction must route through one. You can still collect consent directly through your own compliant notice and consent flow. So when does a consent manager enter the picture? Think about scale and complexity. If you're a small business with one straightforward data relationship with your customers, a direct consent flow may be perfectly sufficient. But picture a large platform where users share data across many services and partners. There, the ability to plug into a consent manager becomes genuinely valuable, both for the user's sanity and for your auditability. Here's an analogy. If you only have one bank account, you don't really need a financial aggregator app. But if you're juggling 10 accounts across 5 banks, that aggregator suddenly becomes essential. The same logic applies. The more complex your data relationships, the more a consent manager earns its place. My advice is to watch how the ecosystem matures. As consent managers become more established and as the framework's expectations crystallize, integrating with them is likely to become a competitive and compliance advantage. So even if you don't need one today, understand the model now because the direction of travel is clear. Let's make all of this tangible by walking through a real consent flow, step by step, the way it would actually happen. Meet Priya. She's signing up for a new investment app called Wealthwise. Now, instead of Wealthwise managing her consent in isolation, Priya chooses to route it through her consent manager. Let's call it Consent Hub. Here's how it unfolds. Wealthwise needs Priya's consent to access certain financial data. It sends a structured consent request through to Consent Hub. Priya, on her Consent Hub dashboard, sees a clear, itemized request. Wealthwise wants to access your account data to provide portfolio analysis. She reviews it, understands it, and approves. Consent Hub records that consent, time-stamped and logged, and signals approval back to Wealthwise, which can now proceed lawfully. Now here's the magic moment. 3 months later, Priya decides she's done with Wealthwise. She doesn't have to hunt through Wealthwise's settings. She opens Consent Hub, sees Wealthwise in her list of active consents, and withdraws with a tap. Consent Hub records the withdrawal and signals it onward, and Wealthwise must stop the relevant processing. See how clean that is? One dashboard, full visibility, easy withdrawal, complete records. That's the consent manager promise in action. As you design your own systems, picture Priya. Ask yourself, would my users have this kind of clarity and control? That's the standard to aim for. Let's wrap up consent managers with a practical checklist, and I'll frame it for 2 audiences because you might be on either side of this. First, if you're building or operating as a consent manager, run through these. Are you properly registered with the Data Protection Board and meeting its conditions, including independence? Is your accountability genuinely anchored to the data principal, not the fiduciaries? Is your technology interoperable, able to exchange standardized consent signals across many fiduciaries? Are you keeping accurate, time-stamped, auditable records of every consent and withdrawal? And can you demonstrate under audit that you act faithfully on the individual's instructions? If any of those wobble, that's where to focus. Now, if you're a fiduciary integrating with consent managers, ask a different set. Can your systems receive and honor consent signals from a registered consent manager? Can you act promptly on a withdrawal that comes through one? And are you treating the consent manager as the individual's agent, respecting the instructions it relays? Here's the unifying thought to carry forward. The consent manager model only works on trust, and trust is built on registration, loyalty, interoperability, and records. Get those four right, and the whole thing holds together. Make sure to subscribe to our channel so you're notified when the next chapter goes live, where we dig into what actually makes consent valid under the rules.